Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of Rolling On or Off Tangent. I'm not sure. Are we going with on and off? I don't know. But look, you'll see it on the video that it says on. We will be talking about a interesting short story written by Robert E. Howard, "The Tower of the Elephant." It's part of the Conan Chronicles, and I believe it has a lot to teach us, even though it was written so long ago. My name is Nikita Zubiv. I am a Russian man of 24 years of age who is single. No, I'm kidding. Who is a bit of a world traveler. I lived in United Kingdom for a while. I'm currently working in Germany as a logistics controller, which is an interesting introspective to what I do in my free time, which is write. And writing has always been my passion. It's something that I've enjoyed both as a consumer and also as a creator. Robert, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Robert Gibson, alias Sendexor, the nom de plume of the webmaster of a site called Solar System Heritage, which implies that I'm at my happiest in the 9 weird and wonderful planets of the solar system. That is to say, their literary manifestations, not the rather comparatively inert and boring ones that actually exist. I apologize to NASA for my remarks. And this includes the really strange third planet of the solar system, which we happen to be living on, which is actually does have real life on it as well as literary life. So there's an interesting coincidence there. And that's why I have the excuse of talking about the Conan stories as though that was part of solar system heritage.
Hmm.
I'm by profession a private tutor, semi-retired now, and like Nikita, I'm someone with a passion for writing, lifelong passion for it.
Right. And I am, well, you can call me XJ. My given name is actually Xiangjun. But if you don't know Mandarin, forget it because you butcher it and I'm not going to respond. Not because I'm being rude, but the phonetic changes will render the, the words different and I wouldn't be able to recognize it. My background is visual effects artist and I've been in the creative line for quite a long time, and I decided to pick up writing because I am a storyteller at heart. Um, I think of all the things that I worked on in my professional life that could be most well known to all the geeks and nerds out there would be Clone Wars. I was I love working on that show. Um, I am writing my own book. I'm also writing a book with Nikki, and I submit some of my stories to Rob's website. That's how I got to know Rob because there was a short story writing competition, and I submitted an entry to his website. Although, to be fair, that story I wrote was never meant as a short story, so it was rejected. Anyway,
Fascinating.
so to kick off the before we kick off the discussion, there are two things I was hoping we can get into. So, but before that, Rob, do you think you can tell us a little bit about Robert E. Howard and Conan the Barbarian and the Tower of the Elephant?
Sure. Well, the author Rob T. Howard is one of the so-called Three Musketeers of the legendary magazine Weird Tales, which started in 1923. And The other two of the so-called musketeers were H.P. Lovecraft, who's probably the most famous one, and Clark Ashton Smith, who's actually perhaps my favourite of the three. But Robert E. Howard was the most straightforward of the three. He was an action writer. He happened to be very good at it. Unfortunately, he shot himself at age 30. But even so, he managed to leave behind an enormous body of work, including 18
Really shouldn't be.
Conan stories. Now, I just want to tell you about the first part of the three parts of the Tower of the Elephant, which was actually the first Conan story to be written from scratch. There was a previous one that he'd cannibalized one of his other stories to provide a quarry of material for, but although it's a good one, I'll ignore that one and start off with Tower of the Elephant. I want to say right at the beginning that I subscribe to a theory of criticism which might be called critical mass theory, to give it a pompous title. Basically, I think writing is about what you can get away with. If you can get away with a certain number of good aspects in your writing, you achieve that critical mass, and then it doesn't matter how much you go wrong, you've got away with it, and the defects just get swallowed up and they just disappear in the good points. And that's what I think happens with Robert E. Howard. You can make niggling criticisms, but none of them are of any significance in view of his triumph. So, Tower of the Elephant, a very early Conan story, and as soon as you open the book, which
Hey, look at that.
this one, and ignore all the stuff written by Lynn Carter and L. Sprague de Camp and so on. Just read the proper Robert E. Howard's Conan stories. And immediately you get into the Tower of the Elephant. You're plunged into a world which never existed, but fictionally it was 12,000 years ago, the so-called Hyborian Age, full of full of color and excitement, and done in the best way that it could be done. You could say it's a limited subgenre, but if you do it right, then it's a classic of its kind. Along the crooked, unpaved streets with their heaps of refuse and sloppy puddles, drunken roisterers staggered, roaring. So there we go. That's where the distinction between action and description rather breaks down, because the description is so full of action, you might as well say the whole thing is action. And it goes on, in one of these dens, merriment thundered to the low smoke-stained roof where rascals gathered in every stage of rags and tatters. Again, it's movement as well as description. And stuff about the very multicultural environment in this thieves' city of Zamora. As soon as you read Thieves' City, you think, this is going to be interesting. Native rogues were the dominant element, dark-skinned, dark-eyed Zamorians with daggers at their girdles and guile in their hearts. But there were wolves of half a dozen outland nations there as well. And then he goes on about the various nations, which in other stories are further developed. One of them, again, he slips nice and easily from theme to theme. He's talked about the various cultural types. Then he talks about an individual, a professional kidnapper who'd come up from distant Koth to teach woman stealing to Zamorians, who were born with more knowledge of the art than he could ever attain. So he's a bit of a buffoon, thinking he's better than he is. And all this is by way of a build-up to where he's praising the charms of this woman he's planning to steal. And then he says, I know lords in Shem who would trade the secret of the elephant tower for her, he said. And then here's a touch on his sleeve, because Conan the Barbarian is happens to be in that same dive, and he's interested in this. He's heard about it before, and he asks, what is this Tower of the Elephant? And the author, in the ensuing dialogue, which I won't read out all of, manages to perform several tasks at once. He shows what type of person Conan is, who's extremely he's a young but extremely tough, but he's not arrogant. He is willing to learn from other people, and he's rather put out by the discourtesy of the more so-called civilized people among which he finds himself. It's only when he gets given a derisory push by this kidnapper that he pushes back, and it's only when the kidnapper draws steel that Conan draws steel, and then there's a very swift denouement. Steel flashed and the throng surged wildly back out of the way, and then it goes on about the chaos. And when the candles were relighted, they find that the barbarian was gone and the coffin was dead. So Conan is not a man to be trifled with, but on the other hand, he's not the one who started the trouble. So a complex enough character to be interesting. It's not just a thug. And then we find that he is on his way to track down the Tower of the Elephant and the jewel which the coffin says was hidden there. Because Conan's profession at the moment is thief, which is why he's in the City of Thieves. So that's the end of part one.
Right. And what I find about Robert E. Howard is he is not just he's not just very good at his action. He's also a very descriptive writer, as Rob has suggested, and we get a sense of a very well-crafted scene when he entered the garden where the Tower of the Elephant was. Conan at this time he was feeling like miffed, that was feeling rather put down by the contempt the patrons of the tavern had shown him, and he had decided, well, I'm just going to go steal into this tower myself and get the treasure. And
Yeah.
and the description of the garden itself was quite fascinating. But it was to me the real draw of the second act was the tower itself. It was tall, 150 feet. It was described, befitting the abode of a mighty spellcaster, the priest of what's his name?
Yara, that's right. Yara is this terrible wizard that is also mentioned in part one, or he's sometimes referred to as sort of like some sorcerer, but then he's also referred to as a priest. So he seems to have many different masks that he wears for the society, and he's sort of very much feared by people of this land, not just this city, but everybody seems to know who Yara is.
Yes. And throughout the description of the entire second act, you can see hints of who Yara the York is supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
Well, not who Yara is supposed to be, but more like the source of his power, which is very fascinating, which we will come to later on. But you can see scattered throughout the entire description things like that, and while while Conan was exploring the garden, he was surprised by another man who had already stolen into the garden, described as a bit portly, with a big belly, and who calls himself um, the Prince of Thieves, Taurus the Nemedian. And so while in the garden, they got past a bunch of lions. Stole past the guards, got past a bunch of lions, which the Nemedian had taken care of with some really potent venom. And as they were climbing up the tower, which was described as festooned with all manners of gems, they soon found themselves on the roof, which was as richly decorated as everywhere else, but made of some kind of a silvery material that the walls of the tower was built with. And a discerning reader here might surmise that the silvery metal might in fact be aluminium or titanium. And all was quiet as the duo crept towards the chamber. And throughout this entire passage, Robert E. Howard continually impresses us with the decadence of Yara the priest by the way he described the tower. It's tall and glittering and luxurious to the point of vulgarity, and perhaps an indirect way of developing the character of the evil priest himself, because we don't get to interact much with Yara except through hearsay, and I would call this environmental storytelling, which is something that a gamer would know instantly if they played any Bethesda games. It's a very powerful way of telling story that is not, it's very indirect, and I love environmental storytelling because it allows the reader to connect the dots in his or her mind, and I think that is very important in engaging the reader. But back to Conan, so when Conan and the Nemedian Taurus reached the chamber where the heart of the elephant, which is the thing that they were here to steal, the Nemedian pushed Conan away, told Conan to go look for guards, and at this point in time, we can see, although Conan was suspicious of the Nemedians, maybe the Nemedian wanted to keep the jewel for himself, or something like that. He went ahead and did it anyway. And throughout this entire story, you could see, the reader could see that Conan at this stage in his life is maybe a little bit naive and unused to civilized ways. And I use the word civilized quite loosely because that also carries the baggage of deceit and treachery along with it. But while Conan was away looking for guards that might happen onto them, there came a cry from within the chamber, and as Conan was rushing towards the chamber, he saw the Nemedian clutching at his neck, falling to the ground, dead. And our barbarian, the Cimmerian, he was stunned by this, of course, and he examined Taurus's body to see what had killed him. And this is part of where, again, the way Robert E. Howard writes his story, he plants clues and allows the reader the chance to draw some conclusion before he actually tells the rest of the story to the reader, which is, there were no wounds on the Nemedian's body except for a few puncture wounds on the neck. and you could see the way Conan does his detective work. You know, like he was feeling the body. There were no other wounds. There was except the puncture wounds, but then the puncture wounds were there was nothing in the puncture wounds. There was no dart, nothing that suggested that the whatever had killed the Taurus had came from some kind of trap, and he was still in the midst of working it out. Uh, you know, and he stepped into the chamber when the real threat announced itself by the way of an ambush. It was a giant spider. And quite frankly, anyone who has been paying attention to the story at this point would have realized that it was a giant spider, just because of the way the wounds was described, the position of the wound on Taurus's neck, you know. And this part, I have to say, I really, really love this part, because when Robert E. Howard described the action, it was very clear, you know. When Conan did battle with the spider, it was a close fight, and Robert E. Howard took care to portray that, because one touch from the spider's venom and Conan would have been dead. And so the entire fight scene was very dynamic. Robert E. Howard described the action quite well, you know, with making use of space, the space within the room itself, and then describing the actions quite vividly, including the way Conan moved. It's almost like a dancer himself. And the way Conan dealt with the threat, with killing the spider, was not. I like the fact that he didn't deal with it in a straightforward way, like just take the sword and plunge it into the spider. He took a chest, because it was trapped in the web that the spider was starting to spin, and he took a chest and he threw it at the spider, and the missile hit the spider, and that was when he finished off the creature. And after defeating the spider, he looked around the room. The room was filled with riches, but with all those riches that decorated the room, it was in his mind, with all the riches that were already in the room, how much more valuable could the heart of the elephant be? And therefore he explored further to find a way to get to the treasure, the real treasure of the Tower of the Elephant.
Wow, that sounded like an ending of a trailer, you know, like the real treasure, the Tower of the Elephant. That's really good. So that's actually something that's very fascinating about the ending of Act 2, is that as soon as Act 3 begins, Robert E. Howard addresses some of the things that you might be thinking about if you're reading the story. Because previously, Conan has been told that the guards are used to weird noises and all type of strange things happening in the tower. So once he slayed this spider, and he's looking down at it, he's also contemplating the same as the reader probably is. Aren't the guards going to come along? Am I not in immediate danger because I've created all this commotion? But because of the information that we've been given previously, and Conan reinstates it in his mind, he believes that he's somewhat safe. But it also sort of colors the villain that we are going to encounter right at the end of the story. Imagine your employees are so tone deaf to any sort of violence or horrible noises that they don't even go and investigate. This is how frequent this happens, right? The men of Yara have lost any sense of duty to even explore what's happening within the tower, because maybe it's actually more dangerous for them to go inside and see what happened. Right? This is the type of a person we're dealing with. This is a villain. This is a great and horrible man, and we are just about to discover how horrible he truly is, because Conan, as actually rightfully puts, he's not satisfied with all these beautiful riches that he's seeing in front of him. He sees them as a distraction. Perhaps someone else in his place would find it that this is enough. That I would take these beautiful jewels that are around me, put them in a sack, and climb down, and that's it, and I'm going. But not Conan, right? Conan is curious. And his curiosity is part of why he's such a compelling character. Because he goes down and he finds a set of stairs. And as he walks through them, he's getting this eerie, strange feeling that something is very wrong here. He is like a wolf on a prowl, but instead of finding prey, he's smelling a predator. Because as he's walking, he seems to be very cautious with what he's doing. And then finally, he finds this ivory, beautiful door that leads him straight towards the complete and utter, like, what is it called? Swap of the story, where it goes from being very much about the adventure of Conan in and now to the sort of strangeness that you would expect from somebody like H.P. Lovecraft. It goes from being a little bit more grounded. We've only seen lions, and those lions were killed by a toxic powder. But that's something that we can kind of imagine within the realms of possibility. A giant spider, again, not something you will see every day, but perhaps at one point in time, this something could exist. But then Conan meets something that, for us at least, is only a picture that we have seen in depiction of a deity in in hedonism or something. He finds this disfigured statue, at least what he perceives as statue, laying down on this marble couch. And as he approaches it, he fears what is to come. And his fear is somewhat proven right. Because it is not just a simple statue, but it is a creature that opens its eyelids to reveal these big, massive yellow jewels. Behind this marble statue that is now found to be a person seems to be this beautiful red gem. But Conan is no longer paying attention to the prize. No, he's paying attention to the statue, just like we, the readers, are. As soon as I read this and I realized the statue was alive, I kind of forgot completely about the heart. And I think that's exactly what happens to Conan, because he's so much more interested about what's happening here that he decides that his fear that he's feeling is something that he's going to put aside because he's interested in what's going to happen. And then the impossible sort of begins. The sensitive trunk stretched toward him, and Conan's horror froze him again when the being spoke in a strange, stammering voice that never changed its key or timbre. The Cimmerian knew that those jaws were never built or intended for human speech.
Who is here? Have you come to torture me again, Yara? Will you never be done? Oh, Yakosha, is there no end to agony?
Tears rolled from the sightless eyes, and Conan's gaze strayed to the limbs stretched out on the marble couch. And he knew the monster would not rise to attack him. He knew the marks of the rack, and the searing brand of the flame. And tough-souled as he was, he stood aghast at the ruined deformities. Now, we find out something interesting about Conan, because he seems to be very much attuned to torture devices. He understands exactly what has happened to this creature. And this stands to reason that this episode within the tavern that we witnessed, and the various other interactions that he's going to have throughout the stories, are not unique and small applications in this world. No, this is a very cruel place to live in. Conan looks at this creature and he no longer fears it. In fact, he begins to pity it. Another attribute that you perhaps would not understand if you only knew Conan the Barbarian as the zeitgeist that you could imagine, right? You have a lot of people who maybe have only seen the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, or those who have never even read the play. So to them, Conan the Barbarian is a funny caricature. But here, you truly see how Robert E. Howard shows a very different part of him as he looks towards this creature, and he fears no longer. He only feels pity and remorse that he cannot help. This creature turns out to be called Yak Kosha, and it comes from a faraway land. Yag. It is so far away in its totality that the creature uses the words such as planet. It's not from this world. It has come here because it is a refugee from a war it was losing. And maybe a lot of this context that is given to Conan and to us is overwhelming, but it is so utterly in contrast to what's been happening so far and how somewhat realistic everything else has been happening, that this description of what's the story of this creature completely envelops the narrative and creates a very different story. In essence, Robert E. Howard creates a story of revenge, because Yak Kosha has been captured by Yara, and Yara has been torturing him for knowledge. Not only powers of magic, but indeed powers of the dark, of darkness, that he wants to use for his own will, to do as he desires. And this creature has no fight left in it, unless Conan helps it. And Conan is faced with a choice to suddenly believe a stranger, as Yak Kosha promises him that he will be granted passage through the tower if he delivers a simple message to Yara. Yak Kosha gives you a last gift and a last enchantment. He must say this as he brings the heart of the elephant, the ruby that we saw behind, to him. But before that, he must complete a ritual. And so Conan becomes part of this mythos. He is guided by this creature towards its heart. And it gives him the knowledge that this will destroy me in this form. But at least I will have my revenge. And so Conan takes the heart and he seeps the blood of it into the ruby, into the heart of the elephant, which consumes it like it's a sponge. Instead of it being sort of slickly covered across, no, it consumes this liquid, completing the ritual. And from this point on, Conan is no longer the thief who has come into this place to become rich. He has sympathized with the creature, and he is here on a mission of revenge. Perhaps not his revenge, but of one he is going to complete. When he finally finds Yara, he seems to be massive, larger than life, and not paying attention to Conan. Perhaps a mistake that will cost him his life. And when Conan approaches him and says the words and shows him the heart, the ruby. Yara is completely fixated by it and by its power. And what seems to happen, again, I'm interpreting, but it's somewhat of a comical scene in a way, because Yara is shrunk down to the point where he is nothing but a little screaming mosquito on the table next to the ruby. But it is also, at least what seemed to me, a metaphor of his power being taken away from him. This revenge taking the knowledge which he used for these horrible atrocities that he has been committing, until he is basically consumed by the gem. And within it, the last thing that Conan sees happen to Yara is that he is the shrunken man who is assaulted by a giant elephant humanoid with wings that grabs him and takes him some faraway place. Conan decides he doesn't want to stick around for longer, and Robert E. Howard does something very dramatic that he likes doing in all of his work, where he showcases the true power of the entity we just dealt with afterwards. Because as Conan is running down the stairs and he is kind of remembering that he was promised safe passage, he finds all the guards in the lower base of the tower dead. How did they die? What happened to them? We don't get to find out, really. He speculates that the spirit of Yakosha did this. And we can only really surmise that whatever he was dealing with was a very powerful entity. Even though it was so much mutilated, it still was able to grant him an escape. And I think maybe my favorite part of the story is that it ends with Conan not really believing his senses anymore, trying to convince himself that perhaps this was a dream, perhaps this was something that didn't happen. And as he sees the crumbling of the tower, we are left wondering what's going to happen with Conan. What is he going to do after this? And Robert doesn't even put in like in his great adventures will live on as he, gets on a horse and goes somewhere. No, we're just left that he has just dealt with the situation and he's contemplating about it. In my opinion, perhaps this is what Mr. Howard wanted to do to the readers as well. Stop at the right moment and try and assess the situation. Try and think about what just happened here and why did it happen. And of course, we know that Conan will go on to do many great other things. But if this was just a one-off short story, it's quite a powerful way to end it, by just having Conan contemplating on what he just did and what he might have to do. That's the Tower of the Elephant.
Bravo! I think Nikki, you have a gift for storytelling. That's great, man.
Thank you.
I personally thought it was a great place. The way it ended was great for a to be continued.
Definitely.
Which I guess all serial writers will want that kind of stuff. But there's something that I wanted to go into. Actually, before we started talking about the story, which was the cover art done by that was on the book that
Rob showed us.
Rob
you mean
showed
that
us.
one? Yeah.
Because to me, the artist that did the art, I feel ashamed because he's like my favorite artist.
It's like Frank something.
But I can't remember his name now.
What did you say, Rob?
Frank Frazetta.
This one.
Yeah, Frank
Frazetta.
I feel so ashamed, but my mind was blanking out.
It happens.
Frank Frazetta. to me, without Frank Frazetta, uh, the imagery of Conan is completely different. He absolutely was responsible for, to me anyway. Every time I read Robert E. Howard's books, in my mind, like I'm a very visual reader. When I read something, I construct the images inside my head, and I need to have that. Otherwise, I can't see what's going on. And to me, whenever I read any of the Conan stories, I am always watching a movie of Frank Frazetta paintings. It's incredible, man. I just like the raw masculine power of Frank Frazetta's artwork, the strokes, the style. Um, just brings about the just how powerful that civilization, the Hyborian age is, like just how rough it is. Yeah, I just wanted to do a shout out to Frank Frazetta. I cannot talk about Robert E. Howard, any of those pulp fiction 1980s pulp fiction storybooks without talking about Frank Frazetta, because he was the one, he constructed the imagery for me. Yeah. Okay. Enough about that.
No, I think because you are such a visual person, I can relate to that in a certain way, because when I think of something, I also try to visualize what is happening in front of me, and I think the artist that you spoke of, he has such a beautiful way of capturing movement, but also sort of like motive and emotion in the drawing. That I feel that sometimes it does sort of strain that they feel as though they are inseparable.
Well, I mean,
genre wise.
I have to be honest, like, because of my background, I knew of Frank Frazetta before I even knew of Robert E. Howard. You know, yeah,
makes sense.
But so what do you guys think? How do you guys feel after reading The Tower of the Elephant?
I think that story did make quite a good impression on me, but I can't remember if it was actually the first story in the series that I read.
How long ago did you? When did you first read the story, Rob?
When did I first meet the stories? Oh, about half a century ago, I should think. But I was surprised at how good they were. I didn't really expect them to be that good, partly because of the covers of the books. I don't usually have very high expectations of books which have muscle-bound heroes on the cover. I tend to think that it's going to be rather crude, and I'm relatively civilized and refined sort of chap. But what did surprise me was that Howard is such a good writer. He knows just what verbal buttons to press to unlock the reader's unlimited budget for special effects, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
And we've all got a special effects machine in here, and the way it gets triggered is by the right words in the right order. And for some reason, somehow, this Texan who lived among rather rough and uncultured people in Cross Plains in the 1920s somehow acquired an awful lot of knowledge of human history and a stunning gift for I'll just read these lines from the first part. he was too new. Conan was too new to civilization to understand its discourtesies. Civilized men are more discourteous than savages because they know they can be impolite without having their skulls split. So Conan, being treated discourteously in this tavern, he was bewildered and chagrined, and doubtless would have slunk away abashed. But the Kothian chose to goad him further, and that was the last mistake that the Kothian made. But yes, I suppose the tension between civilization and barbarism in the stories, come to think of it, somewhat probably reflects the tension in the author between his wide reading and his education and the rather crude environment in the Texas boom oil towns of the time he was living.
He paints a picture that somehow those who live in the wilds are much more connected to their moral compass rather than those who actually live in civilization and who are more educated. He almost seems to say with his writing that at least in the world of Conan, the less you know, the better you are as a human being, right?
It's
Because
the noble savage idea, isn't it? Yeah.
Right.
It's the noble savage. Yeah, that's right. That was the exact words that went through my mind.
Who's the most evil person in this short story? It's the guy who has the most knowledge and who's craving knowledge and who will stop at nothing to have more knowledge. It's Yara. Yara is the central antagonist, and he's all about having information. Right? Whereas when we see Conan assessing something, he gives himself to instincts, he gives himself to sort of analyzing the situation, but he never tries to sort of overthink it. He assesses and then he acts, right? This is the entirety of his progression within his mind. Whereas you could picture somebody like Yara, he spends hours, right, sitting down at the table, figuring out his plans, making it exactly to the T. You know, here we're going to put a spider, you know, here we're going to have some lions, here's going to be a like a poison trap, and so on and so forth. He's created this elaborate situation, and he's constantly torturing people and this creature, and it's all for this thirst for knowledge. Really makes you believe that those who live in the world of Conan, the more knowledge and information they gain, the more corrupted they sort of become. Because this is not the only antagonist who is a magician. I think there's a lot of them actually in his stories.
Well, I suppose the idea is that the dark arts are not just about knowledge for its own sake, but about power, and therefore it's corrupted right at the start, because you would only want that sort of knowledge if you wanted the power it gives you.
That's right, yeah. Because Conan only that's also like when you look at him as a protagonist, he's not your typical modern day I'm doing this because it's right, or I'm doing this for a moral code sort of thing, at least at first, right? He's there for monetary gain. He's there because his profession is a thief. He is going inside the Tower of the Elephant because he believes he can do it. That's his motivation, right? These people are telling him, you're a young nobody, you're a pup, you can't get this done, you're kind of ridiculous that you're even saying that you're going to scale this tower, right? And Conan's like, no, I'm not, and I'm going to go do it, right? That's his character. He just wants to do this stuff because it will gain him what he wants. Now, why does he want gold and admiration from having to steal this? We're not quite sure, but we do find out that he is a person of character. You know, when he decides that, like, I'm not going to take this gem for myself, I'm going to sort of exact this revenge.
Yeah, to me, Conan is a character that lives very much in the in the moment. It's not given to agonizing over philosophy too much. You know, it's a
That's right. Yeah.
Mm.
it's a man of action from top to bottom. Yeah, and I think like the thing that really appealed to me about uh, the Conan stories is the simplicity. It is it's just about describing an action. Well, it's about describing an adventure, not an action. An adventure, and then things happen. He describes the surroundings. Uh, Robert E. Howard doesn't talk that much about the things that's happening around. Like there's no underlying message he was trying to say, no moralizing he was trying to say. I mean, everyone is biased. All writers are biased, and so there are certain things that we can glean from it, such as his.
Mm.
Uh,
There is some progression in the stories. He does acquire more of a sense of responsibility.
Sorry to all our listeners out there. We have had a little bit of technical issues, like the network dropped out on us and the recording froze. But anyway, before we end the podcast, I thought, we can have some final thoughts about Tower of the Elephant. Like, anything else that we thought was cool about the story that we want to bring up in particular?
Yeah. I've got one remark to make, which is to do with the background, which is the first couple of pages. It's important in this kind of story that the reader doesn't get left with the impression that the background was just hurriedly constructed like a theatre backdrop to provide a sort of scene for this particular bit of action, that actually the author is writing about something that was there. The hero or the protagonist is wandering into a landscape that was there before he was there, if you see what I mean, independently existing. And you get that very well in Tolkien's work, and you also get it in Howard's Hyborian Age. You get the feeling that it's all there, it's all been worked out, it all exists, and Conan doesn't just create it by being there. He's a product of it. It's not a product of him.
Yes, the world building is quite good. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't. Yeah, I wouldn't even begin to suggest to understand whether or not he had everything planned out. But if he didn't, I have experience in basically filling out the parts afterwards, after you say something. So if indeed Robert E. Howard said all these things about all these cultures without having like a small bibliography of things he already knows about the world, and then he sort of like built it throughout the stories, and then the bibliography came later, I think that is something that's fascinating, and that's something that everybody can learn from. Now, if he did have everything sort of like written down already, then he's a madman. And I mean, it's crazy that you've built like an entire world, and then you would write a short story in it. I think it always happens in a reverse, where you have an idea for the story and then the world comes later. But regardless, something that's fascinating about the Tower of the Elephant itself is the character of Yakosha, because it's not the last time that Conan gets to speak to something that is quite so powerful, and much more powerful than he is. But this is one of the only times where such a being doesn't actually desire to harm him. And something fascinating happens is that Conan is very slowly lulled into believing that he wants to help Yakosh. So, upon first reading, I always thought that Conan is this man with a brave heart who wants to help this creature because he sees it and he pities it. But upon further reflection, it is also very possible that the subtext is Yakosha has influenced Conan's mind into helping him in this last request. Now, of course, that's a bit of a reach in some aspects, because the text doesn't give us that much of a hint towards it. But it's something that I find very interesting because it recolors the entire conversation completely. It is instead not a sort of a carefully laid out backstory in front of us so that we are invested in this character, but it might be something that Yakosha is specifically using because it knows that this might be its last chance to actually do something about its situation. And the fact that this short story has something like this where you could sit down and analyze and kind of create a completely different narrative, if you just look at the social cues and the key events just a little bit differently, is truly what speaks to the beauty of the short story and of the work of Robert E. Howard. That's what I think I enjoyed the most. That even after reading it for the third, fourth time, I caught myself thinking about something that I never thought before, while having it in my mind previously. It showed me a different facet of itself when I was reading it this time, and that's what I find so fascinating about it.
To riff off that, like I said before, I knew of the artist long before I knew of Robert E. Howard. And what I found after when I first read Tower of the Elephant years ago, not quite as long as Rob, that many years ago, but I did remember feeling like this does remind me of H.P. Lovecraft. And I never understood the connection until much later when I realized actually these three people, they do know each other. They Robert E. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, and H.P. Lovecraft, they communicated with each other. And because like some of the what word should I use? I think flavor would be a good word. The flavor of the last scene with the Yogg feels very, very much like a scene that H.P. Lovecraft would have written, talking about Cthulhu and the things out there, you know, and
Definitely.
and I also thought it was very interesting how Robert E. Howard pulled in some aspects of the real world when like there are threats of the real world in his world building. You could see it in the things that he write. You know, I do believe he used the term light years.
That's actually something that I wanted to mention and completely forgot. Thank you for bringing it up.
Go for it.
You see how different the characters are, even based on the way they speak. And I mean speak, because when you look at vocabulary of Conan the Barbarian, it's very limited. But when you hear the Yakosh speaking, he uses words like planet. He uses words like light years. He speaks in a scientific way, which sort of informs you of how alien this creature really is to this world, because everyone else is behaving like it's medieval times or even the Dark Ages, right? They have a very different society compared to the modern age. And then you have this creature who speaks of concepts that are so beyond them that they would just consider it magic.
Yeah. Well, a final note from me would be I quite enjoyed the physical description of Yogg. It's like a mix between it's like an angelic Ganesha. You know, he head of an elephant and he had wings, which was quite an interesting mix of Indian and biblical mythology. All right, man. So this ends the podcast for Tower of the Elephant. Any final?
Thank you for listening. Just want to thank our listeners for doing what they do best, listening.
Yeah, we will be back again with another episode on another short story, and look for us on the channel soon. All right.
Goodbye.
Right.
Okay.
So are we off the air